Right, so this may be one of those webinars where we have some real trouble with connectivity. And this morning, Livestorm was saying they had some trouble, but we were hoping it was gone. We have internet connectivity yet. The colleague in Ireland who was really struggling to get online, and so was I, and I'm in the UK. So we there seems to be a fairly general thing. We're going to soldier on. I think let's see the best we can do. Yeah, I think maybe everyone was kicked out. So welcome back. Hello, Milos. Great that you can join us from Bosnia and Herzegovina. All right, we're going to soldier on. At the very least, we will be sending you a replay kit. So we will record it and let you have the information. My apologies for any trouble that we're having, technical difficulties. We will be trying to sort these out as much as we can. Hey, welcome, Mel. Nice to see you here. And hello, Claire. All right, so welcome to the webinar. This is on board meeting number 34 and also our 21st issue of GCF Insight. And that's quite a milestone in the UK. 21 is the age where you, I suppose, become an adult, although it's perhaps shifted more to 18, but you might get the keys to the house or something like that. So we've had 21 issues of a GCF Insight, and what a lot of great content there've been on that, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of many of our readers as well. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here today. Along with my colleagues, I have Marcus Arcanjo from ECO. He's an analyst here in our team. He's going to be heading to the COP, so I'll mention that again later. If you're going to be at the COP, it'll be great if you can connect with him. And we also have Margaret-Ann Splawn here from the CMIA. She'll introduce herself a little bit later. My name's ECO. I think I know many of you on this call, but just for those that may not have met me before, I'm the founder of the company ECO. My background's engineering, but I'm really specialized in addressing climate change and in market creation types of projects, which we've worked on throughout the world. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here and to interact with you. ECO's an international climate finance and development consultancy. We're uniquely specialized in the design of low carbon climate resilient projects and programs. That means that really that's what we do. We don't deliver implementation of projects and such like. We specialize in that upstream design, development of low carbon climate resilient projects that really work, that deliver. We've been doing it for over 20 years. Our team of around 30 staff members, consultants have been providing technical expertise to help our clients solve climate adaptation and mitigation challenges and diverse projects, the huge diversity of adaptation and mitigation projects that we've worked on. I'm so glad to see you introducing yourselves into the in the chat. Please, if you haven't yet, do that. You're very welcome. Our agenda is quite simple here. Firstly, my colleague Marcus will be discussing this 21st issue of GCF Insight. It's on enhancing private sector investment in tackling climate change through the GCF. I'll be unpacking board meeting 34 with great pleasure and privilege of having Margaret-Ann Splawn from CMIA in the call as well. She attended the meeting in Sondo, so we'll be able to get her firsthand experiences. Not only attended the meeting, but is the active observer to the GCF. So huge welcome to you, Margaret-Ann. I'm so pleased you can join us. Instead of the QA at the end, we're going to try and take it as we go. So Marcus will make his presentation. If there are questions to answer, we'll answer them right then and there. Otherwise, as Margaret and I come onto stage, we'll handle questions as we're going through the presentation, see how that works. And we'll be sending out the webinar replay kit afterwards. So do sign up for our latest thinking list to receive it. We'll send you a link for that. I've mentioned the polls. Please do participate as we go along. We've got a poll that we are about to launch. I'm actually going to do it. Is it launched? I don't know whether I can actually launch it. We want to ask the question, is there a problem with access to the GCF? This is a really big question of discussion. Problem of access to the GCF. And we've kept it really simple. There's only two answers to this. Either yes, you think there is, or no, you don't think there is. We'd be really thrilled if we could have a look at that and answer it. Do you think there's an issue? I'm going to come back to it later, but tongue-in-cheek, the executive director of the GCF, Yannick Klemarek, said at the board meeting, there is no problem of access to the GCF. I being a little bit tongue-in-cheek, a little bit humorous with that response, but we'll be able to discuss it a little bit later. It was something that stood out for me that we're going to cover. The polls. Submit your questions as we go along. There's a question tab, which you can access just next to the polls one, and you can put in questions there or in the chat. Super. So I see already answered the polls on this. Is there a problem? We've got responses so far. Any guesses which one's coming out at the moment? All right. Super. So keep going. I think I've covered everything. Marcus, over to you. Marcus, it's all for you. very much, Marcus. Really appreciate it. It's an interesting study. And as you said, we will be distributing it, if you haven't had it already, together with from this webinar. So you can watch it again or later if you wish, and also read the original report. Marcus is to take questions now, if you wish, if you have questions for him. We are also feel free to add them at any time to the questions tab. We can bring Marcus onto the stage and we can address them. We are now joined by Margaret-Ann Splawn. Margaret-Ann is the Executive Director of CMIA. I mentioned that a few times, the Climate Markets and Investment Association, which is the secretariat based here in the UK, isn't it, Margaret-Ann? You attended the board meeting as the private sector active observer. Margaret-Ann, welcome, and could you please briefly introduce yourself and your work? And we're not hearing you. We're going to have to try and debug that. Mute yourself. Can we hear you?
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Yes, welcome.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, yeah, no. Thank you so much, Grant, for inviting me here today with you and Marcus and the rest of the team. We have been working together for several years. ECO is a very important member of the Climate Markets and Investment Association. And what I really appreciate is the work that we get to do together. And often I feel like 3 times a year we come together basically around the Green Climate Fund, as you mentioned. So I serve as the active private sector observer for the Developed Nations constituency, which means, for those that aren't aware, is that I actually get to sit in at the board meetings and provide private sector insight and expertise to the board for decision making. Now, doing that, representing the private sector, it's not my opinions, it is the collective group's opinions. So I get to work with very smart people such as Grant and Marcus and the rest of the team, but as well as there's several here as well, Carl from Camco and others. And really collectively, we look at what are the barriers to entry to work with the GCF, but not just the GCF, is really we're looking for how do we build blended capital solutions, or how do we get more actively involved in climate finance, reducing the barriers. So that's a bit of my background and why I'm here. I was on the ground and I'll be sharing a bit more about that. But I just want to, it's always wonderful to get to work with the team at ECO. It's always really super interesting to share the insights as to what's happened at the Green Climate Fund, and really happy to facilitate any questions that you have. Back over to you, Grant.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. I think we may have a clash between 2 different sets of screen sharing, but I'm sharing it live here from my side. All right, so our agenda to cover is these items shown here. Firstly, we're going to talk about the report of activities of the Secretariat. I always find this fascinating. Yanis Glimak, the Executive Director of GCF, presents what GCF have done in the last accounting period. And I find a fascinating insight into what he, as the Secretariat, are planning to do in this part of the board meeting. So there's a lot that we can glean from that. I'm going to just touch on a few of those issues. And just maybe as a preface to my opinion on a whole lot of things, they're not necessarily any official opinion. I tend to be rather outspoken, but it's probably better that way. And so my apologies if I tread on any feet as we go. I'm going to give my point of view for things. So report on the Secretariat. We're going to talk about the work program of the Secretariat for 2023. this is the final year. We're going into the final year of GCF 1. That is the first funding round of the Green Climate Fund. And towards the end of this period, they are mobilizing or already mobilizing to get contributions for what's GCF 2, the next funding round. So this is the final year of it. So there's some interesting dynamics related to that. We're going to talk about the approved projects. There were 9 of them. We're going to talk about proposals. We're going to talk a little bit about the data board meeting. We're going to give you a little table of the timelines that you need to bear in mind for that. So, Margaret, what really stood out for you from this board meeting?
What stood out for me was the board approving one of the projects, one of the private sector projects.
Okay, thank you. So we'll dig into that a little bit more. I hope you'll share some of the insights from that short part of it. So let's push forward. So firstly, this is the update on the activities of the Secretariat. I'm really apologies for the blurry view of this slide. I took it from the Executive Director's presentation. It's cut out of that, so it's a little bit blurry. The interesting thing here is the financial plan. The strategy is never to sit on idle money or be over-programmed. And what you can see here, shown in this diagram, you can see, one second here, you can see on occasion, the dark green part of the chart is the what they actually committed to projects. The light green part is the overall authority, the overall commitment authority. What that means is that GCF has, in a sense, in its bank, this much money that it commit to projects. Commit money, it's not allowed to commit money that it doesn't have. But you can see, if you look at this board meeting, they committed basically everything that they possibly could. This presentation was given before they actually approved the project. But at the end of this board meeting, all of the 9 projects, $2 million in the GCF's accounts, as it were. I mean, it's not strictly speaking their accounts. They've got a lot of money, but they're only able to get money that has already been given to them. And then here, from this point onwards, this is their projection for the next 3 board meetings, March 23 and October 23, and also into March 24. And that's definitely the end of GCF 1, the first round of GCF. So you can see that GCF is committing to projects as much as they possibly can. For 23, the work plan is to target this is in the words of Yannick from the presentation, our target is not what we can do in terms of program finance, in terms of commitment authority. The main issue for them is the volume of financing. They have more projects than they are available money to fund it. We're now getting back a little bit from the actual committed amounts to look at the pipeline, GCF's pipeline for projects. And there are remarkably more than 300 in that pipeline at the moment. You can see there are 238 concept notes from public sector and 7 from the private sector. Obviously, these private sector projects are much larger than the projects that are there for the public sector. It's because with 97, it gets to a total 6.5 billion. This is an indication, definitely, the demand or the flow of concept notes at that level far outstrips the available funding. All right, so the next point on this, if I just head over to the next to look at what that pipeline looks like in terms of funding proposals. If you're new to the GCF, you first have a concept note, and then once you're through that and you think you've got a good project that could go to the GCF, you put together the funding proposal, a much larger, more complicated document. There are, this is at the end of August, 31st of August, the data was available for that. There were 51 public sector funding proposals already submitted, already in the pipeline, and 25 private sector. And period between 1st of June and 31st of August, there were 5 new public sector and 2 new private sector ones. Looking at GCF funding requests, this comes to going on, you add those two together, about $5 billion dollars requested to the GCF for that period. And you can see a little bit of a breakdown in those proposals. There are 34 at what is essentially the first stage, it's stage 4.3 of it, then 28 in the analysis and recommendations made to the board, 2 that are currently with ITAP or were at the end of August, and 12 that are ready for submission to the board. That is end of August. The actual numbers that materialized on that. Right. Let me just jump back to the slide here. So the next point really is to address this thorny question of, is there a problem of access to the GCF? To hear your views on it. And let's just jump into our poll. Is there a problem? Okay, it's published, the results are published, I think. You can see of our audience that has voted so far on that, there were 24 votes. 83% are saying, yes, there is a problem with access to the GCF. We didn't give you too much choice, just a yes or no, and 17% said. Our report sector is talking about the barriers, and we definitely an issue there, availability and access to the GCF. This was actually the discussion at the board. Just jumping into that sort of question, it was during this from the update on the activities of the Secretariat. He said his words, do we have a problem with access? No. Much more demand than we can supply. He says he's asked this question all the time, but in fact, there are way more projects that there is to come. But as I mentioned, perhaps a little his response to it, because he went on to give a lot of detail there around it. See here, I've just taken a table from that report. It says the number of funding proposals, 26. Access entities, because this is normally the topic that is covered really in terms of access. And this represents around 35% pipeline, total pipeline. And the requested funding is around 1.2 billion. So, yeah, this is sort of an open question. Jan, this by volume, creating that he said we need to split the idea of access into categories. Some of those categories, one is volume, one is the simplicity, how to make the fund easier to access. I think that's what many of us think of when we think initially of access. Right. So, that's really the core elements of this. How do you see it, Margaret-Ann? I mean, you come specifically from the private sector perspective, do you see what stands out for you as the main barriers for the private sector, as opposed to the private taxes entities?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I was there when Mark mentioned there's not a question of access, it's a question of, we have more demand. However, let's be quite frank, gaining access to the GCF requires you first to become a delivery partner, which is what's called an accredited entity. So I think already there's this notion of what does the private sector call something and what does the public sector call it, and it's called an accredited entity. And to do that, can take between 1 to 2 years, and it's a significant challenge by the private sector to the GCF because navigating becoming a GCF accredited entity is a proper long process. It's cumbersome. It's not straightforward, even though they are trying to help it there, but it requires time, money, and commitment from private sector companies. And many private sector companies aren't quite prepared for the bureaucracy involved to becoming an accredited entity at the GCF. And then when you add that as well to these direct access entities with, let's say, less capacity or less support, these barriers to entry are even more pronounced. So one really has to make a concerted decision that this is the route that they will want to go down to become an accredited entity at the Green Climate Fund, because it's not an easy route. And there's a lot of rules and stipulations that are required in order to become a delivery partner at the GCF.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Margaret-Ann. Complex, it's essentially coming down to that.
It is, and I think what's interesting, though, is because, one of the things that I do wonder about is that the way that it was decided was before funds were actually dispersed. So they set up a lot of these processes and procedures before you're actually doing it. And as you know, the private sector often you're learning by doing, and so then you readjust. But to readjust policy or procedures that are already established at the GCF is tricky and difficult. And I think for private sector companies, it's sometimes difficult to understand because of this notion of unanimity, so that everyone agrees, and getting everyone to agree at any one time on change or on how things should be run is difficult. And one of the things that I would note is that I don't think the board, and when I see that, doesn't quite realize what particularly private sector entities have to go through, and the level of patience and money and time and energy. And public sector entities, have a bit more of that. I would say the multilateral development banks have a bit more of that because they're very much more aware of this UNFCCC processes. And we've got to remember that this fund is not a fund set up from a private sector entity. It's, really a financial mechanism of the COP, and so it's these two worlds colliding, which is slightly different, and I think this exacerbates and causes a bit of pain points for the private sector to enter into this, and not just to enter into it, but to follow through and then to maintain that level of commitment.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bunch of questions that have come in. Been going. Let me just see some of them. Nasia, just a quick one about the concept notes. Are these total concept notes submitted? I think yes. I don't have a definitive answer to that. GCF says these are concept notes in our pipeline. So I would imagine that's what it is, but it's not defined in detail. They're definitely not ones that received the green light move meeting. That was very brief insight into it. Libahang, I remember rightly from the chat, you said you're in Johannesburg. Say hi to Johannesburg from me here. I lived there for many years of my life. run courses on GCF project preparation and best practices? That's a great question for us. We actually have got a free session on doing preparing theory of change, which is coming up soon. But yeah, there are various courses that we're running them almost all the time for various clients all around the world. It is something that we're doing. When we go on to the next part of the presentation, you'll also see that GCF is planning to really scale up training for people to enhance access. So that's briefly on that question. Camille, I think we'll come to your questions a little bit later. You're raising a number of issues that are real and legitimate barriers. So let's see if we can tackle them a little bit later here. And Ken, you have noted that our survey was really example, our ability to access GCF stakeholders is, of course, somewhat, and we really focused on the private sector here. So we had a much smaller audience of respondents for it. We are obviously trying to reach as many people, relevant people, for our surveys as we possibly can. Doing in-depth studies or case studies on proposals and approved projects, we do dig into them a lot. We're going to have a chance to dig in a little bit to some projects in the next moment. And I'm just going to finally just raise this issue of the accredited entity fee. I've never actually heard that before as one of the major barriers. It's really food for thought. I know you're speaking from practice in CAPCO and the challenges you'd have in that context. We often see, depending on the type of organization, that there is a fair amount of staff from executing entities, some of their costs covered through the main project budget. Of course, there's a bit in doing that, and also making sure one needs to make sure focus in on understanding that these activities that are being funded are not part of the ongoing duties anyway, as part of the accredited entities' duties as part of management of the overall project. There's two separate budget lines, should we say, in terms of those fees. Okay, I've just jumped in there, perhaps from an overall theme point of view. This is taking up quite a bit of what I would like to do now is to jump forward in the presentation, given the time and the delays that we had right at the beginning, to jump forward to talk about the projects went into for funding. I think we have a bit of a limited time to go into more detail on the other aspects that we're going to cover. So hopefully you're in agreement with me to move forward into that. Interestingly, when you think about it here, there were 17 projects that the GCF submitted to ITAP. ITAP, Independent Technical Advisory Panel. ITAP didn't endorse 4 of them and endorsed another 5 of them with conditions. We don't have, or at least I didn't access the details of what those conditions were. It's quite usual for a board to put conditionality onto a particular funding agreement. So that's not unusual. Conditions applied to them. That in the past that many of these projects that were not endorsed then get revised and come back again completely. And then there were 3 proposals that were approved by the Secretariat and by ITAP, but they were deferred into the next available board meeting to exceeding the available authority. And that's the underlining the big challenge of accessing the GCF that that were raised, Yannick's response, well, there's not a problem with access, is that the demand far outstrips GCF's ability to fund projects. They even fully approved 3 additional projects which they couldn't bring to this board meeting. So, are putting forward a proposal. Remember, this is highly competitive. So there were a total 9 projects approved. This is almost $600 million from the GCF, total, including co-financing, $1.8 billion. Bit of it is quite interesting. There were 6 direct access entities, so they really that's way more than usual in board meetings, in my experience. Balance of the projects addressing adaptation. You can see 2 were purely adaptation. It was supposed to be 6. 4 were mitigation, 3 cross-cutting. So overall 5 that did address adaptation in some way. And 43% of the funding was earmarked for LDCs, SIDS, and Africa. Interestingly, and because of the larger scale projects, there were 6% of the funding is private sector funding. So here's the full list. We have only a little bit of time. Which ones of these shall we discuss in more detail?
I mean, I'd like to discuss obviously the 3 private sector projects, and we could be very quick on which are the last 3: 196, 197, and 198. However, in the interest of time, and I know that it's not all about me and about private sector, I'm going to leave that up to you. And I can be very brief, or I can, or I can expand. I think let's start from the last one, which is 198, 1.5 initiative. That was from GIZ, which was their first private sector project. And it's really around accelerating venture capital within, within Africa and Latin America. And by the way, this has been...
So I just wanted to mention, as we're looking at the overall picture of the projects, that we had the privilege of working with SPC to develop this in Vanuatu. Also helped AFD with the PEEB Cool project for work with both AFD and with SPC to help them to mobilize and get through the GCF processes. I think what also stood out for me, I'm really pleased to see a wastewater project here, because often wastewater streams are not covered. So that's quite an interesting one to have a look at, how they managed to get that funded. In the waste sector, we've seen a lot of reluctance from GCF in the past. And then the project, which I like, e-mobility and low carbon transport from CAF. That one's also notable. If you have got some time to dig into the proposals, do have a look at those. So let's do just what you suggested, Margaret-Ann, and jump straight onto this GIZ one, which is over here. What are your views on this?
Okay, we're going to be very quick on this. And what's interesting is that this was for the GIZ's first private sector project, and it's design, and it's in West Africa and Latin America, so 13 countries, 5 in Latin America, 8 in Africa, and it's designed to support venture capital flows in the clean tech sector in both regions with an acceleration program. And there's a small grant component for less mature pre-seed ventures. And this was approved without comment. And what's nice is, so this is kind of the first concerted effort of this. There was no talk about this. In the interest of time, I'd rather move forward. And interesting to note, 196, which is from the Korean Development Bank, was the first of it was the first approved project from the Korean Development Bank. If you could go to 196, yeah. And it's of supporting initiative mechanisms for the industrial mechanism. It's a long line, but what's really interesting about this is this project supports a structural shift in Indonesia towards the adoption of more energy efficient approaches in industrial activities. The country ownership was high because the government of Indonesia was involved since the beginning. And this program kickstarts an energy efficiency market ecosystem that will make investments commercially attractive and will scale and function without further need of concessional finance. This is kind of the first of its kind and could be used in other Asian countries. Great initiative. This went without fail, no problem. But 197, FP 197 took 3 days to approve. And this is because, I would say largely because it was a brand new projects. And so this is called the Green Guarantee Company. And this was submitted by accredited entity MUFG. And what's interesting about all of the private sector projects is they all have different executing entities. And so we could talk about this, but in the interest of time, we won't. But this is the first time that there's a guarantee vehicle that, is, and that the Green Climate Fund becomes an equity investor within a company in order to help facilitate green guarantees in these current countries across Africa, Asia, and in the LDCs. So, but this there was a few issues of this, and one of the most contentious issues was the role of being GCF as an equity investor. There was the risk or the concern of board members that GCF proceeds could be used outside of non-NOL or non-objective letters coming from this. There was a talk of a lack of pipeline as this was a new investment vehicle set up. However, the Green Guarantee Company is backed by the Development Guarantee Company that's done lots of guarantees, and the MUFG is a very well-established banking entity. Finally, it was approved not for the total size of 82.5 million, but for half of that size, and then with a view that it will be re-looked at and that the funding will continue based on the results. Overall, I think it was highly contentious because it was the first of its kind, and whenever we're seeing the first of its kind presented to the board struggles with that. So I'm conscious of the time. I don't have a hard stop, but I think you all do, and thank you so much for the time. But I think we're going to see, as we see more innovative projects coming out, we as the private sector need to help facilitate and discuss how, while they might seem new at the GCF, these are green guarantees or something that are done in capital markets currently, and so it's not really so much new as maybe new to the GCF. Back over to you though, Grant.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's one of the things, and I'm excited about that in its broadest terms, is that GCF actually is getting projects that are pushing the boundaries of what you would normally be finding within a donor-funded and supported type of area. So you can see this MUFG project, the type of questions that GCF often get approached by private sector companies that are struggling to explain their message to GCF about, well, give us money, but we don't yet have identified projects because this is a demand-driven thing that causes a big hiccup at some stage. Just to give you an example of that, it's one of those areas where there is an experience in the GCF and it's matching with GCF's expectation and track record and such like. So I'm pleased to see these projects eventually getting through. I think this meeting point of private sector and public funding is a good place for that to happen, but it happens quite slowly, frustrating. There's a long, complex process, and our webinar has gone a lot. Sorry about the connectivity issues right at the beginning that really put us out of time on this. I'm just going to make some closing remarks. If you need to drop out, of course, I understand that, but just 3 minutes or something like that. I think Ignacia and Carl, you've both asked questions around the commitment authority and how that is being addressed. There was quite a lot of talk about that. In terms of where do we stand on the future budget, it really is down on this. GCF expects its commitment authority to be around around 500 million for board meeting, in 600 in July, and 670 in October. So this is implying, depending on the size of the project, is implying something between 7 or projects being approved each board meeting of next year. So that's challenging for those that have projects that are almost ready to go, but GCF doesn't currently have the funding for it. Payment from the U makes a difference, but in fact, there's more to it than that, because GCF1 got a certain amount of funds that have been committed, and it's going to be all used up by the end of the year, end of next year. Just some concluding remarks. A reminder that we are going to be sending out the replay kit. And thank you so much for joining us at the and huge much appreciation to you. The collaboration is always wonderful with you. Really appreciate our work with you and with CMIA and the sort of access that you give us to this bigger picture of these discussions and debates that are going on. Thank you so much for that. Thank you to all our participants. The next planning is an Eco Institute Theory of Change training webinar. We'll be joined, I'll be part of that, also by our consultant, Devashmita. She will be, she's got a lot of GCF experience with theory of change, from the broader, bigger picture of what is theory of change, and then say what is a GCF theory of change. We'll touch in on that, but it's all about the GCF. Theory of change is relevant for many, many different other funds. Is the COP27, connect with him. If you're going to be at the COP, he'll be there for the first week. So please do get in touch if you'd like to connect with Mark while there. Those are the three things. I did them in the opposite order from the slide that's on the screen. Please do visit our website. It's www.ecoltdgroup.com. Connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Really much appreciate that. And we'll see you at our next webinar, perhaps at the training session, which is coming up on theory of change. We'll let you know, yeah, the dates for the theory of change. Good question. Let me just see, maybe one of my colleagues will post it in the chat, but in the meantime, look it up. So let's just see. We are planning it for I think to be best to send that out to the team. I'm not seeing it in my calendar. My colleague has said that's because we haven't actually settled on the date for it yet, because of some travel and such like that's been a bit postponed. No date yet, but please, we'll send out the information to you and let you know. Great to see you there, Lebohang. Super. Thank you, everyone, for participation. We look forward to seeing